Good evening, and thank you for joining us for the National Health Service Corps' 2012 webinar series. Tonight's webinar is Substance Abuse and Treatment, Crystal Methamphetamine 101, presented by Dr. Elizabeth Disney. Dr. Disney is the Associate Director of the Broadway Center for Addictions at Johns Hopkins Hospital and is also an Assistant Professor of Psychiatry at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. She supervises the clinical services for the Broadway Center Clinic, which is the hospital's outpatient drug and alcohol treatment program located in the heart of East Baltimore, a medically underserved area. Dr. Disney received her Ph.D. in clinical and developmental psychology from the University of Minnesota and completed her postdoctoral training through the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. The goal of tonight's webinar are to increase comfort in diagnosing and treating and referring patients using crystal meth whom you may encounter in the health center environment. Learn how to separate the facts of methamphetamine use from the media-generated hype. NHSC is pleased to offer continuing education credits of 1.5 hours for all disciplines participating in this webinar. To receive credits, you must attend the full 1.5-hour session. We verify attendance by your answers to several polling questions. Once you respond to all the questions, your attendance will be noted. At the conclusion of the presentation, the operator will provide instructions on how to submit a question through the conference bridge line. You can also type a question on the screen at any time. We would appreciate it after the Q&A session if you would take a moment to fill out the webinar evaluation. This will help improve future sessions. Thank you again for joining the 2012 NHSC webinar series. We hope you find this webinar useful in providing service in your community. Now please welcome Dr. Elizabeth Disney.
Hello, and welcome to everyone out there across the nation. This is a really new and different experience. I haven't given a lecture by webinar before, so I'm looking forward to the adventure. I understand all of you are pros, having come to several of these already, and I also just want to acknowledge your dedication for sitting through lectures in the evening after a long day of work. So I will do my best to make it as interesting for you as I can and to move as quickly as I can. And I generally like to take a lot of questions, so if folks have questions, I would like you to feel free to share them, because I think that will make it more interesting for you and for everyone else. So thank you, Barbara, for that really kind and lengthy introduction. It's a little bit embarrassing, but I appreciate it. And on the screen, you'll see my contact information. I'm happy to get emails or phone calls if people want to get in touch with me with questions they have after this presentation. And actually, probably the best way to get in touch with me is the email. So please take a note of that. And if this conference is anything like the other NHSC conferences, I'm sure you will all get copies of the presentation afterwards. So in case you fail to write it down or you lose the piece of paper, that can come. So let's get started. I've been doing this for years, talking about methamphetamine, educating about methamphetamine. And when I started, I would regularly encounter people who didn't know what it was or hadn't seen a patient with methamphetamine. That's no longer ever the case. So I'm assuming everybody here is pretty familiar with what it is. It's in the amphetamine stimulant class. That cocaine is also a stimulant. Amphetamines are a subset of stimulants. So that kind of gives you a sense of what its chemical cousins are. One of the things that makes it unique among drugs of abuse is the length of the time that a person is high after just one use. So as you can see on the screen, and it's hard not to be able to point, folks who are novice users can be high for 8 to 24 hours after first use. So you can see in areas of the country where it's modestly priced, this is a very good value for the dollar in terms of the length of the high that you get for the amount of money. And obviously it's taken off in the last few years, but it's not a new drug. This drug was first synthesized in 1919, and it didn't really take off until about the mid-'80s when someone came up with a way to make a smokable crystal that retained its chemical integrity when smoked. And so it's really similar to the way cocaine grew in society from, cocaine used to be just a drug that only a few people used. It was expensive. It was for the elite. And then somebody figured out how to make crack, and the market exploded. So we had kind of a similar story with methamphetamine where, once someone figured out how to make a smokable form, it really made it a lot more marketable. I'm sure everybody knows, especially now in the era of Breaking Bad, that this is a chemical you can make at home. And that's another thing that makes it unique. So a lot of our other major drugs of abuse, they, have to be imported from outside the country. Heroin comes from very far away for the most part. But this is a drug that people are still capable of making at home. And the photos that I have on the screen there are some more kind of setups that, on the upper left, there's a setup in a cardboard box for making meth. On the kind of middle, I guess I would call that, you can see somebody's got a meth lab in the trunk of a car. There's more modern methods where people can literally make it in like basically a 2-liter bottle of soda. Well, not with the soda in it, but in the 2-liter bottle. So it's the labs have shrunk over time. The recipe, there's a couple different recipes. The ingredients for many of the recipes I've listed there. Sometimes that's worth, if you have a big problem, really educating patients about what goes into meth, because it's so basically disgusting. These are not chemicals you'd want to put into your body necessarily, like Drano or gun cleaner or brake cleaner. But the other point to be gleaned from looking at the ingredients there is how flammable they are, that they're really quite explosive. You notice that, let's see, what is that? Third from the bottom is anhydrous ammonia. That's the farm fertilizer that's also used as an ingredient in making bombs. So it gives you a sense of how volatile these meth labs can be when they go wrong. But almost every recipe has one thing in common, or actually every recipe has one thing in common, which is that they require pseudoephedrine or ephedrine, the stuff that's in cold tablets. And that's why Sudafed and the equivalent have been restricted nationally to try and cut down on the volume of meth labs. And that's been very successful, actually. So what I'd like to talk about first is usually everybody here is going to be, have seen meth patients, but I think that one of the things that's helpful in seeing meth patients and being successful with them is really understanding, as with any drug, why someone would use. That when we're sitting there, we're sitting in a consulting room across from a patient and they look horrible and their life is falling apart, you have part of your brain that wonders, well, why is this person doing this to themselves? Why can't they see it's destroying them? So I think it's helpful to really understand what the high is like in order to understand why people keep coming back again and again. Because it's not, it starts as a very rational behavior. It starts as something that's very, very, very rewarding. So I think that when we're encouraging people to consider sobriety, we need to really think about what we're asking them to give up and understand what a struggle that can be. So I'll tell you a little bit about the experience of using methamphetamine and how it affects, by talking about how it affects the brain. It affects 3 different major classes of neurotransmitter chemicals. And gosh, it's hard to gesture in this screen. So I want to do like a 1, 2, 3, but it's hard to do that. So I'm going to talk about 3 different classes of neurotransmitters. I'm going to talk about serotonin, I'm going to talk about dopamine, I'm going to talk about epinephrine, norepinephrine, because this drug is active on all of those different chemicals. So I'll talk about each one in turn, but as I'm talking about it, be thinking about how all these effects are happening at once. And so be trying to imagine what that's like to have all these effects going on in your brain and your experience at the same time. So the first thing that this drug does is that it really increases the amount of serotonin in the brain. And if you had to stereotype for what serotonin does in the brain, you'd stereotype it as kind of like being responsible for our feeling of well-being in the universe. That people who are really low on serotonin really describe the experience of just being miserable, ill at ease in their skin, just feeling like things are not well. So having very high serotonin is really the opposite of that. It's a feeling of just general well-being, lowered anxiety, lowered self-doubt, feeling confident, feeling great about yourself. Really a state of comfort and of fearlessness that many of us really seek. You know, that in normal life it's average to walk around with a lot of anxiety. But on methamphetamine, that routine anxiety of daily life really drops away, and people feel 100% confident that they are really attractive and sexy and just very intelligent, you know, just feeling fabulous about the self. So that's something that is sometimes hard to get in daily life. And just to note that this is part of what makes the drug dangerous is the decrease in anxiety causes people to make decisions that they wouldn't make otherwise. You know, that it's not a smart decision to have a lot of random sex with strangers because there's real risks involved. But on this drug, it doesn't seem so scary. It seems more like, well, why not? It could be a good time. So people are more likely to take risks they wouldn't otherwise take. And so feeling great about the self, feeling really good looking and handsome. At the same time, this drug is also impacting dopamine, really increasing the amount of dopamine in the brain. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter we always talk about when we talk about addictive drugs because it's one of the ones that almost every drug acts on. So it kind of got the stereotype of being the reward pathway. And technically, it's almost more like it helps the brain bookmark and a reinforcing experience to remind us that, ooh, that was something really good. Let's go back and do that again soon because the results were really, really good. Oh, excuse me. Sorry about that. So this drug releases more dopamine than you can release in any kind of normal life experience. I mean, by a huge factor. So normally we get dopamine release when we do things that are rewarding. So we get dopamine release from eating fatty foods, eating sugary foods, flirting. When you flirt with someone and they flirt back and it feels really kind of exciting, that's actually a dopamine release that's responsible for that. Obviously sex, that causes dopamine release. So, you know, you've had lots of experiences in normal life that release dopamine. You know what that's like. But what we don't know is that on methamphetamine, it releases so much more dopamine than these activities can release in normal life. So, as I've noted on the screen, it's 15 times as intense. So imagine, you know, the experience of eating chocolate cake while having sex, while flirting with someone new, while winning the lottery, all at once, 15 times more intense. It's a little, being high on methamphetamine is a little bit like that. So that's one of the things that makes it so hard to give up is we don't normally get that much intense pleasure and reward in normal life. And it is more intense than cocaine. That's one of the things that you notice is that if on the screen, cocaine raises dopamine levels just 4 times. This raises dopamine levels. This is probably one of the reasons why this drug leads to users report kind of a hypersexuality at times. You know, increased interest in sex, increased desire, responsiveness, increased, it's more pleasurable. They're probably recognizing that increased dopamine reminds them of their sexual experiences. So increased serotonin, feeling reduced anxiety, feeling great about the self, increased dopamine, feeling intense pleasure, and then at the same time, the effect on the third system, adrenaline, noradrenaline, or also known as epinephrine, norepinephrine. This is our fight or flight system. You remember this if we talked about it in high school biology. That's why I put the little graphic up there of the guy fighting the bear, because this is what this system was designed for, is that in exciting or stressful situations, this system clicks on to bring us a lot of energy, help us really focus in the moment, and do whatever needs to be done. It decreases our, other drives. So it decreases the drive for sleep. It decreases the drive for food. It even decreases, if you're feeling thirst, you won't even notice it so much. So it gives you a very intense, focused, kind of get things done state of mind. And it also even decreases your sensitivity to pain. So that's one of the reasons, people are already on this drug in a very sort of hypersexual state. Sometimes they get into having so much sex that they injure themselves. There have been men who masturbated until they literally took the skin off of their penis because they didn't feel it. They were so focused, they were so energized, they were feeling so much pleasure that they didn't realize they were actually hurting themselves. And some of the other effects that come along with turning on this system, the adrenaline noradrenaline system, is decreasing immune function because, trying to use all your energy right here, right now, not worry about what's going to happen 10 years down the road. So that makes the person more vulnerable to infection. And also, this is why the side effects of this system being turned on are also why you see, and I apologize for the colloquial term, but this is what users will call it, crystal dick, meaning difficulty getting an erection after amphetamine. And that comes from this system. Actually, it kind of constricts the peripheral small blood vessels, so like your little blood vessels in your, in your fingers, your feet. Think about when you're in a fear-inducing situation, you tend to have cold hands. The little blood vessels in the penis are also peripheral blood vessels, so they're constricted, so you can't get good blood flow, so therefore folks have trouble with getting erections. And this is why people then start to mix this drug with Viagra and other similar drugs in an attempt to override those effects. And it's obviously not a good idea and kind of dangerous to be mixing these drugs that both have pretty widespread effects on the cardiac system. So that's the description of the experience of being high on meth. So remember, feeling great about the self, feeling a profound sense of well-being, at the same time as you're feeling intense physical pleasure, more intense than you ever experienced in normal life, at the same time as you have this huge surge of energy that allows you to get things done and just focus on being in the moment. You're so energized. This is a state that a lot of us would really love to experience. And this is a state that makes it very difficult to walk away from. So I think when we're asking people or suggesting to people that they consider moving towards sobriety, we do have to really reckon with that we're asking them to give up something that's been, in many ways, a very positive experience or a very rewarding experience. So I think that that's helpful in working with folks. Sometimes people like to know all the technical details about how this is going on. If this doesn't interest you, just go na-na-na for a minute. But if it does interest you, it, as I said, it increases the release of neurotransmitters in the brain. Another thing that makes it unique is it also blocks their reuptake. So reuptake is that system, where they're like little vacuums in the brain that collect the neurotransmitters and save them for later. So that they're out there in the synapse, they're doing their thing, activating brain cells, and then they get sucked up to be saved for later. This drug blocks that system so that the neurotransmitters are just floating out there in the synapse, doing their thing until they break down. Any chemical eventually falls apart. So the neurotransmitters literally get kind of used up with repeated use. They're loose in the brain until they're no longer until they are no longer basically the same chemical. And at the same time as it's blocking reuptake, this drug is also blocking the action of an enzyme that is kind of like the extra, check and balance system. So if the reuptake system doesn't get the neurotransmitters, there are enzymes that also help break them down. This drug also blocks the activity of that enzyme. So this is the reason why, the neurotransmitters get used up, they're used until they no longer exist rather than being conserved in any way. This is why you crash so hard from this drug, especially when you're a new user. That the first basically 2 weeks after using are very miserable because all the energy that your body used to get you high, you have to reconstruct all those drugs. It takes the brain a while to bring those neurotransmitters back to the normal levels. So that's why people feel so miserable for 2 weeks. And it is worth reminding people that, okay, you're going to feel horrible for 2 weeks, but don't think that you're going to get stuck feeling like this permanently. This is just, you will feel better after 2 weeks. It's a temporary thing. Of course, there is evidence that if you keep doing this over time, systems get altered, that it's toxic to both serotonin and dopamine-releasing neurons, and there are studies now showing a link with later Parkinson's in life, which, as you remember, so a person can't keep doing this indefinitely with impunity. This graphic basically just shows you what I already told you, which is that dopamine goes down in the brain of a methamphetamine user, that over time abusing the dopamine system causes it to downregulate. So you're no longer getting as much dopamine, and that is not a good experience. You do not want to downregulate your dopamine system because dopamine is what gives us pleasure. It gives us the normal little pleasures of daily life. Like after this, I have a box of chocolates, and I'm going to eat some chocolates, and I'm really looking forward to that. If I had no dopamine going in my system, I would eat the chocolates, and they would do nothing for me. They would just be like, I might as well be chewing an eraser, like for the amount of pleasure it would bring me. So that's why when people are in this crash where they have very little of some key neurotransmitters, they're so miserable that, really nothing helps them enjoy life or feel better. Next slide just makes the same point again in a different graphic way, but also makes the point that, I'm oversimplifying a little bit here. I'm talking about some of the most salient effects of these neurotransmitters, but they're doing lots of other things in the brain. So when you decrease dopamine, you're also slowing your motor reactions. You're also impacting your memory. I mean, I'm sure you know that there's no neurotransmitter that just does one thing in the brain. They're all really complex. But this slide is really important because it has some good news on it. And this is something that I do like to share with patients, which is that while repeated use of methamphetamine over time does downregulate the dopamine system, there is evidence that if you keep, if you hang on to your sobriety, if you really commit to sobriety and hang on to it over time, you're going to get that back. So if you can look on the screen, you see at the top there's a normal brain, and the closer to the red end of the spectrum indicates more, and the closer to the blue and purple end of the spectrum in the picture indicates less. So you can see normal control's got a nice amount of dopamine there in the center of the brain, and then somebody who's just been sober for 1 month off methamphetamine with a substantial history of abuse is almost, you can see, a much reduced density of methamphetamine, of dopamine. But then when you go down to the scan at the bottom, it's sort of a good news, bad news situation. And the good news is you can compare and see that it looks more similar to the top brain. So this is somebody who got their, or these are people who get their dopamine back. The bad news is that you can see that this is folks who are abstinent for 2 years, which is no joke. It's not easy to put 2 years of sobriety together. So I think that that's the one of the things that makes this drug particularly difficult to quit is that, that it's very, very hard to get to your first month of sobriety. And you can see that the first month is pretty unrewarding, and that the rewards come long term. So I think it's important to just reassure patients that the rewards are coming, and that their brain isn't, sometimes people have this fear that they've broken their brain, and I like to tell people that recovery is possible. I think that's an important message. So in general, educating people about the what we call the post-acute withdrawal syndrome, or basically the way you feel when you are coming back from a crash, I think it's really important because you want people to understand that they feel awful at the beginning of their attempted sobriety, but it's temporary. It is going to get better. So some of the things that I think I skipped a slide. I did. So some of the things that we see are first, they're miserable emotionally. So severe depression, severe anxiety, particularly a social anxiety where people have trouble going outside. They just feel like everybody is talking about them in a negative way. People don't like them. Even going to the grocery store can be kind of stressful. Imagine trying to go to drug treatment groups or 12-step meetings. Make it difficult. Irritability, vulnerability to getting involved in domestic violence incidents, decreased interest in sex. To the degree that this drug really increases your interest in sex, then when you crash, it decreases your interest in sex. And I've had men say to me that they're worried that they're never going to want to have sex again. And so it's good to be able to reassure folks that, yes, this is going to come back. You are going to be interested in sex again. Give it some time. Likewise, sleep also tends to improve with time. So this can last 30 days. This can last 90 days. It lasts for a while. So it's good for patients to be aware. There's also cognitive functioning impairments. And again, if patients are concerned or comment on this, it's also worthwhile just educating them that these are probably temporary, because they're so anxious and so miserable in this crash period. One of the things that they often are stressing about is worrying, oh, have I permanently damaged my brain? Maybe I'm never, you'll see them kind of groping for words that they know that they know. It can be a little bit heartbreaking. And so it's good to be able to remind and reassure them that, this is just what happens in the first month to 3 months, and it will get better. So what we know from lab studies are decreased ability to pay attention, decreased ability to learn and remember new things, decreased ability to plan ahead and organize, and decreased ability to control impulsiveness. And just to pause for a minute and observe that, these are all qualities that people really need in order to do well in recovery. We need you to be able to pay attention in group, learn new strategies for controlling emotions, learn how to plan ahead to avoid dangerous, drug-soaked situations, and learn how to control impulsiveness so that when you first think, man, I should really get high, that's not the thought that you go and act on. So I think it's particularly diabolical that this drug impairs those abilities. And my empathy for people that are working on their sobriety from this drug. Another side effect that you do sometimes see, unfortunately, in early sobriety are amphetamine-induced psychosis. Particularly if you work in behavioral health, you've probably seen this already. So it kind of mimics, it can look a lot like schizophrenia. And really, there's no clear, someone always puts up their hand in the conference and asks, how can I clearly differentiate one from another? And the answer is you really can't. You've just got to kind of wait it out and see whether it gets better. It's sure that the patient continues to be sober, but there's no easy way to be really clear about where this came from or, what are the symptoms you're looking at. So it occurs in about a quarter of heavy users, can have all kinds of unpleasant hallucinations. A lot of times they're very they tend to be auditory. They tend to be kind of social. If we were all having an auditory hallucination right now, that would be similar to one that someone might have in meth, on meth, or even, unfortunately, sober. It might be that that in the background of this conference call that you can hear someone talking about you and commenting negatively on whether you're paying attention, whether you're dressed appropriately, whether you're really a professional, whether you should really be here. Just like crazy, unpleasant, difficult thoughts that become like a commentary. So really miserable for patients. And unfortunately, if someone has abused meth long enough, sometimes this can be a permanent condition. So I like to warn patients when they start developing auditory hallucinations or any kind of hallucinations that that's really a sign that the good times are starting to end, and that the likelihood of increased possibly long-term or serious and really unpleasant side effects is starting to increase. Really a good reminder that this is a time to start thinking about sobriety. Once the patient does have these symptoms long-term, I don't tend to really want to necessarily keep reinforcing the connection with methamphetamine just because of the really wretched guilt that patients often suffer. Really have trouble letting go, saying, I did this to myself, and it can become almost like a suicidal rumination, that guilt really makes the suffering of having an unpleasant psychotic experience. That's not something that I'll tend to want them to dwell on. It's much better to just accept that, this is part of life experience. Lots of people cope successfully with it. There are medications that can help with it, and let's work on improving that experience. I sometimes get the question of, can you overdose? Yeah, you can. It's not very frequent. It's about not that different from overdosing on cocaine. So you can compare in your mind. You don't hear about people doing that very often. So it can happen. It's not very likely. If you do overdose, the way you will go, what it looks like is you'll have seizures, you'll have a stroke, you'll have a heart attack, you'll have a cardiac arrhythmia. Really the best advice that I give to patients, if they're still actively using, they're not willing to stop, what I will encourage them to do is to make sure you don't mix downers and uppers. I mean, the research and the evidence is really clear that that's the pathway to increasing your risk for death. It's drugs that have opposite effects. So if you're doing uppers, just stick to uppers. Don't combine them with drugs that help you relax. And, like anyone else, if you have unusual new onset chest pain, even if you're high, you should still go to the emergency room. So how does meth affect the body? Obviously, I probably won't have to spend a long time telling you that it's not well. You all have seen patients whose bodies are negatively affected by this. These are some slides that Sheriff's Department collected a couple of years ago to just help educate the public about the effects of meth over time. And this is all available for free on the web if you need anything to help do public awareness campaigns in your clinic. This just gives you a sense of how exhausting and how aging for the body this drug can be. What are you looking at? So just to talk a little bit about, what's causing this dramatic difference. So here on the upper left, well, actually, it's more clear here on the upper right. This gentleman with the mustache and the beard. I don't know if you can see my pointer. When you look at him, 1999, he has a fairly symmetrical face. When you look at him in 2004, you can see his face is much more lopsided. This can reflect the impact of little mini strokes that he may or may not have any awareness that he had. When you see that kind of asymmetry. I mean, obviously, this is not my patient. I've never met this man, so I'm just guessing, but just kind of showing you what you might be looking at. Also, extreme weight loss. As I said, patients are not hungry at all when they're high, so they tend to lose weight. It's probably clearest in the gentleman on the bottom left. He's a much more kind of like a healthy weight on the left, and then 2 years later, more skeletal looking. What else do I want to comment? Oh, the skin rashes and the sores. Amphetamines make you pick at your skin. You get really obsessed with little imperfections. You get really, really, really interested in trying to smooth them out. So you can see, particularly among the two women that are represented here, you can see they were really just probably digging at their faces. And when you've downregulated your immune system, you also, you have more infection. These little at areas get infected more easily and stay infected for longer. Anything else I want? Well, and then also just the toxic effects of chemicals we're not even really aware of. I mean, these drugs are made in underground labs. They're not made by pharmaceutical companies, so a lot of them are contaminated with heavy metals and all kinds of stuff you don't necessarily want to put in your body. So that's kind of what you're looking at. This is a graphic that you can find on the web if you want to post it in your clinic. All you have to do is Google 10 years of meth use, and it'll turn up. These are arrest photos of the same woman over time, and they run kind of clockwise from the upper left-hand side. So the upper left-hand side is the oldest photo, and then you can see she ages over time. You can see even the tooth loss, and just really how meth affected her life. And my understanding is that this is someone who did pass away from the effects of her drug use. So I don't know if that's useful to you, but just in case. Let's see. So also talking about physical effects of meth, I did want to remember to say that whenever you're seeing a patient who has meth, remember to be thinking about HIV. This is very likely somebody who's having a lot more sex than they used to have, with a lot more people than they otherwise would, and so you always want to be thinking about STDs, and particularly HIV. So just some stats for you. In a study done at UCLA on men who have sex with men, that's what that MSM means, men who have sex with men. So they may or may not define themselves as gay, but they're having sex with men. Among meth users, the mean number of partners that those men had was 17 a month. And even among heterosexual women users, they still found over 2 months almost 8 sexual partners. So really substantially more than the average population. So you always want to be thinking about, is this someone you need to refer for testing for I'm going to skip that slide. That's actually not a concern people raise. No, I don't know if your curiosity is telling you. There used to be a myth that crystal was helpful for folks with HIV, and I'm really not hearing that anymore. I think we did finally kill that myth, thank goodness. I do get the question, sometimes people are just really wondering, why the close connection between sex and meth? Why are the patients so hypersexual? Why? So there's no one answer why. Like anything else, it's multifactorial. But as I've mentioned, this is a drug that increases sexual pleasure, increases libido. This is also a drug that decreases your anxiety. So sometimes one of the things that hold people back from being more sexual is just their anxiety that other people would think that they're gross or not be attracted to them. This drug removes all of that. People feel fantastically attractive, so they're much more likely to proposition more people. Cognitive effects. This is a drug that reduces your decision making and your inhibition of impulses. So you're more likely to act on a quick impulse or thought that you might have. Then also probably part of the effect is that often people are introduced to this drug by a sexual partner. So in the context of sex are told, that got to try this. This is going to be the best sex you ever had. And we know that with any drug, even alcohol, what you expect to have happen when you use it really impacts what happens. So the more you expect that this is going to be a drug that will make you feel very sexual, the more likely you are to see that effect. So it is also worth making the point that this does differ. The impact on sexuality does differ between men and women, which is probably not a surprise. So this is from a poll across a couple thousand different users of different drugs. So what you see along the bottom there is what is the person's drug of choice, and they ask them a lot of different questions about different aspects of their experience. So this tells you the percent that responded yes. Yellow's male, green's female. So the question here was, my use of my drug of choice has made me become obsessed with sex and or made my sex drive abnormally high. So if you look on the left, you can see opiates, well, like heroin, painkillers. Almost nobody says yes, and that's generally opiates kind of little bump with alcohol, so people feel much more sexual with it. And then when you get into the stimulants, like cocaine, and particularly methamphetamine, that's when you really start to see this skyrocketing. So half of men on cocaine and 3/4 of men using methamphetamine said, I was obsessed. My sex drive was abnormal on this drug. And so you can see the women are trailing behind, but on meth it's about, almost half of women. So there is a substantial gender difference. And there's an additional question. I just forwarded to the next slide. They also asked the question, my sexual behavior under the influence of my drug of choice has caused me to feel sexually perverted or abnormal. What percent of people said yes to this? So again, opiates, hardly anybody. Alcohol, just a few. And then with cocaine and methamphetamine, with the stimulants, you really see it's almost half of men are saying, I'm worried that I'm some kind of pervert. And that's a really loaded language. I mean, people who feel like that they might be a pervert, or people who feel deeply ashamed of themselves and feel like they have this sick secret that they really can't share. And it's very important as healthcare providers that we help patients to talk about that and to realize that they're not alone, and that they can go on and leave this experience behind them and go on to have another satisfying and more average kind of sexual life. Because sometimes there's this fear that after everything I've done, who would ever want to have sex with me again? I am so disgusting. And it's important to counteract that and help people keep moving beyond that. And that's certainly the role of counseling also. And how does meth affect the teeth? I don't think I need to spend a lot of time on this. I'm not a dentist. I'm a psychologist. So I'm sure it's not good for your teeth. I'm sure you may have seen the pictures. Those of you who are dentists here could, normally I would call on you and you might have quite a bit to say about your experience with this. And again, it's multifactorial. What causes this? It's no one thing. It's lots of things. People aren't, brushing their teeth. They're not thirsty. They're not drinking water. They have less saliva. They're grinding their teeth. Remember I talked about those little blood vessels being constricted? You have little blood vessels in your gums, too. You don't want to constrict that. And then on top of that, meth itself is acidic. It can eat away at bone and flesh itself. So to briefly talk about who's using and where is it the worst? This is just a compilation of some random photos of different people who've been open about their recovery from meth that I pulled off the internet. If it was going to be perfectly representative of who's using, it would be more evenly balanced between women and men. I just had a harder time finding pictures of women. And it is kind of representative that it's a mostly Caucasian face, or they're all Caucasian faces, actually. This is a drug that has made bigger inroads in that population than in other populations. So this is, everybody usually likes to see the United States map with where meth is the worst or where the use is the heaviest on it. The government used to, National Survey on Drug Use and Health, they used to update this really regularly, this map, but in recent years they've been slowing down. So I do apologize, this is 2008 data. That is the latest data that this map is available for. But I've been tracking this map over many, many years, and the trends have not substantially changed. I mean, frankly, it looks fairly similar across a wide span of time. So what you see is, as you know, that this drug most severely impacts the West Coast and then really spread to the Midwest, and is still not very present in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, comparatively lighter impact. The reason this graph shows 18 to 25-year-olds is those are the folks who use the most. So those are your high state and see where you fall. And then this is the map also as far as national prevalence. It just shows you the prevalence of methamphetamine labs that are being discovered and reported to the police. So again, it gives you a sense for how much there's going on in your area, but remember that this is data that's subject to lots of bias. So first of all, police have to be interested in this issue and have the money to pursue it. And they have to discover it. It has to be reported to them. So, there's lots of noise in this data. But I guess what you can see is that the strongest cluster is really kind of not exactly in the center of the United States, but just a little bit. You see over here. It's really hard to not be able to point. I'm sure you can see where I'm looking. And the West Coast, despite the higher prevalence of use out there, they cracked down early and hard on meth labs and saw some results from that. You know, so the rest of the country came along in 2006. That's when the act restricting pseudoephedrine over-the-counter sales was passed. And it was just a tremendous, tremendous difference. So you can see this is the most recent data. This is 2011. So the total number of meth labs reported in the United States were 10,000. And that's down from a high. I was doing this in 2004, and at that point it was 17,000. So really a lot of change over time. But what the change has meant is not that people aren't using meth. It's just that now it's being made in Mexico, and it comes across the border, more like other illegal drugs. So for those of you who work with kids, I did want to remember to say a few words about the effects on children. And certainly I'm, again, probably not surprising you when I tell you it's not positive for unborn children. And that from everything that we know so far, it's really similar to prenatal crack cocaine exposure. So as you mentioned, remember from when we were talking about the impact of the drug on the different neurotransmitters, remember we talked about how it constricts the little blood vessels? You don't want to constrict blood vessels in pregnancy. You know, that's helping supply the pregnancy with oxygen and nutrients. So when those blood vessels are constricted, naturally children tend to be born smaller overall. You know, lower birth weight, smaller global brain volume, which is actually indexes well with problems with attention and memory. So you don't want to have a small brain. Also higher rate of mortality, more likely premature. Those are also things really similar to crack exposure. One kind of caveat that I want to share is that we want to avoid becoming hysterical about crack exposure in pregnancy in the same way that we did, we want to avoid the hysteria in working with these moms and not copy the mistakes of the prenatal crack when that was an epidemic, sort of the way that was spun in both the science and the popular literature, I gotta say, the news media. You know, that there was this kind of myth that prenatal crack exposure was going to lead to this race of horribly damaged children that were just going to devastate society. And I have to confess, I actually wrote one of those papers that put out that idea in the scientific literature, you know, just looking at all the risk factors and all the concerns. And what we learned over time is that, let me go to my next slide, there's not some magical thing that happens before birth that permanently does incalculable, terrible damage. What really seems to, as the children exposed to crack have grown up, one of the things we've learned is that while it's certainly not good for children, that the more powerful factors are actually some of the factors that occur after birth. So the environment, you know, that being born into a home where someone's using drugs in pregnancy is usually pretty good red flag for a couple of people who aren't really well prepared for parenthood. You know, they're not necessarily in a great place in their lives right now. So the child arrives in that environment where, you know, there's all kinds of other drug use that will be ongoing after birth, the chaos that comes with that, doctor visits, having lots of other mental health problems. You know, that those are the things that really have some of the most powerful negative impacts on child development. And so kids with prenatal drug exposure who are adopted into healthy homes tend to really do pretty much surprisingly great. And that it's the kids who are continuing to be exposed to all the problems of drug using parents that struggle more. But it's not because they have some terrible permanent brain damage. That, you know, I think one of the reasons we want to get away from that idea is that it's kind of a hopeless idea. You know, that's not helpful to parents and their kids to say, that your kid is permanently damaged. And frankly, the research shows that it's not that true either. So it's not a good concept to be spreading. One of the things that does make meth unique in working with it from a kid's perspective is that you can see children testing positive for meth as if they were using meth, when actually the only thing that's happening is they're absorbing it from their environment. And so here you got this photo here is a news photo of first responders going into a methamphetamine lab, and you can see that they're pulling out an infant who was living in that lab. And you can see that the first responders are wearing full-body hazmat gear, because that's what it takes to make sure that when you walk into a meth lab, you don't absorb it through your skin. And you can see, obviously, the infant has no protection whatsoever. So of children who are taken out of meth labs or homes where meth is being made, a very high percentage test as if they themselves are using. And they're absorbing it through the skin. There's secondhand smoke. There's also, particles that fall. Smoke is just like dust particles in air. So the dust particles eventually, fall onto all the available surfaces in the home, the floor, the table, anything. And, kids are always going all around, putting their hands on everything, putting their mouths on everything. So they're picking it up that way. So even in homes, about 10% of homes where they're not making meth, but they're smoking it really heavily, you can see I used to co-present with, for a while I was co-presenting with someone from law enforcement, and so he would just shared some of his photos that he had of meth labs that they had busted and where kids were involved. So like here you can see someone was literally weighing out and measuring meth right next to the crib. This was one where a gentleman was making meth. This was a kind of old-fashioned coffee setup. He's watching his lab while he's also watching his child. This has some implements and things that are meth, right down on the coffee table where kids can get at them, where there's snacks laid out. And this was a photo from a trailer. This is a trailer in Iowa where the parents really did not want to expose their children to what they correctly recognized were the toxic fumes. So when they were cooking meth, which was, not infrequent, they would put the kids outside in this dog kennel, and it gets, for any of you who have been to Iowa or live in Iowa, it gets pretty cold there. So really, like you can sense both the parents caring and they're attempting to, protect their children, and just also how they're impaired by drugs and their judgment is terrible. Other child protective workers have also found kids who were really drugged up a lot with benzos or Benadryl to keep them asleep and to keep them out of trouble in the lab. So we don't have a lot of time to talk about that in detail, how to handle this if you're running into these kinds of agonizing, painful situations with children in drug labs. But I wanted to make sure you know about this very fine organization that was formed to address this issue and to help provide information and support and flowcharts, recommendations, best practices, training for anyone who's working in settings where they're running into kids in these kinds of. So this is the National Alliance for Drug Endangered Children. The web address is on this slide, nationaldec.org. And I don't know if you see it in highlight like this, but our facilitator was kind enough to put it down as a web link, so you can also just click on it from here, I think, which is kind of cool. So I would definitely recommend that if you need to learn more about how to handle those situations. So I also want to make sure that we spend some time talking about what do we know about treating this problem, because that's actually the area that interests me the most. And the thing that's probably the most important thing to remember from what you heard tonight, if you only remember one thing from this whole lecture, please remember this, which is that recovery from this drug is really possible. That there used to be a myth that really circulated that, here's the myth. Meth users are untreatable. They only have 1 to 5% recovery rate. You still see this sometimes on TV. This is completely untrue. There's no data that support this. This is a statement that somebody just made up, I think, with the goal. They wanted to scare people away from using meth. But ultimately, this myth is really much more destructive than it is helpful, because it says to people who've already used meth for the first time, your life is over. It's hopeless. Just give up. You're never going to get sobriety. And that is a really destructive and unhelpful and untrue message. So the good news is that recovery from this drug it's about the same rate as from any other drug, but it's really similar to using the other stimulant. It's similar to recovery from cocaine or crack. So if you've had experience with cocaine or crack users or family members who are cocaine or crack users, you know that it's not easy to get sobriety from this drug, but it's very possible. So it is important that, especially in our role as healthcare professionals where people look to us for, knowledge, that we are sharing that, yes, you absolutely can get sobriety from this drug. People can, they do, they get their lives back, they feel a lot better, because that's the truth. So what do we know works? The model that's most often recommended is called the matrix model. There's a ton of research about this particular model being effective for this drug. And it's nothing really bizarre or unusual. It's basically what a lot of drug treatment programs are doing already. So it's an IOP model, meaning intensive outpatient program. This isn't a drug where people need to go inpatient, and frankly, not that many people need to go inpatient at all, contrary to Hollywood myth. Most good drug treatment happens on an outpatient basis. So this is something that folks can do outpatient. Well, when I said it like that, it sounds like the inpatient drug treatment is bad. What I want to say about inpatient versus outpatient is that we use inpatient a lot less than families expect. That it's not the first thing you try with somebody with a serious drug problem. You only recommend inpatient if they repeatedly demonstrate that they can't get sobriety any other way. What you want to do is try an outpatient program first. What families or even patients expect. So this, like many other models, is an outpatient model, including cognitive behaviorally oriented individual therapy, group therapy, 12-step meetings, relapse analysis, meaning that we realistically expect the patients are going to relapse and that we help them use that experience to learn how to make sure that doesn't happen again. Obviously, drug testing. The things that make this model perhaps a little bit different than what the average clinic is doing is family sessions. We all know that we should be doing family sessions. It's often very difficult to get family to come in, but the research is clear it helps. That when you help the person's whole network, you help the person. So that's an important part of the matrix model. And also peer mentoring, that there's really a good role in treatment, not just in 12-step, for people who can speak to, that I have recovered from this drug. Look at me. I have my life back. I was once where you were. I was, out on the street. I lost all my teeth, et cetera, and now I'm doing so much better. That speaks to someone in a way that we as professionals sometimes can't. That's a part of the matrix model. So if that's something you're interested in, it's a blessing that the government actually was so excited about the matrix model and the great research findings supporting how effective it was that they bought the whole thing, and it's now available for free. You can download it on the internet. And this, I meant to edit this slide. You used to be able to get there from this link. This link no longer works, but our web, is it fair to call this is the guy who's helpful kind of our webmaster, put a link for the matrix model on our web page, which I don't currently see it down there, but it'll come back. You can also just Google it. If you are in a setting where you work with gay men at all, it is worth knowing that treatment seems to work better for gay men if they have specific groups that are just for gay men. And the reason for this is because, as I mentioned before, there's so much sexual behavior that goes into this drug that if you don't feel comfortable talking about what's happening for you sexually, what's going on in your sexual life, if you don't feel comfortable talking about that in a mixed group, which many gay men do not, obviously, it's dangerous for your recovery. You know, you have to have an environment where you feel comfortable talking about your sexuality and what's going on in your sexuality. So we know that having a group specifically for gay men is much more helpful than just trying to mix them into the general population as far as this drug is concerned. So UCLA has kindly made their treatment manual available. It's a very nice manual, and I've worked with and I've been very happy with it. Run any kind of group, I would recommend it out. And I don't have a listing recommending, you know, what you should do for your women methamphetamine users to talk about their sexuality, or your straight male methamphetamine users, because frankly there is no curriculum for that right now. Somebody really needs to tell you about it if there was one. And so maybe if you're looking for something to do, that would be a good project to take on. So even if you don't have specialized groups for, if you're working with women who use meth populations, no matter who you're working with, you want to be sure that you're addressing sexual issues. You know, I think by this point you've hopefully been, you're really aware of the how closely sexual life and meth use become intertwined. So I'm most concerned when I'll ask people, you know, what percent of the time that you're high do you have sex, and what percent of the time that you have sex are you high? And I'm worried if it's half or more. That to me indicates that this is going to be a significant recovery and one that we really need to talk about. Also, sometimes people really start fantasizing or focusing on methamphetamine-oriented sex. So the sexual fantasies can start to revolve around drug imagery. Not unusual to see a patient who will have a fantasy he would use for masturbation of injecting. You know, like literally would imagine the needle going into his arm. Can't use my, it's hard to even see my arm on this camera. So is imagining the needle going into his arm, and that's the imagery he's using to bring himself to orgasm. Obviously that's a concern, you know, that if someone keeps fantasizing about that and masturbating to that imagery, it really reinforces the imagery in the brain. You know, it makes the link stronger. You know, this image is linked with pleasure and keeps it fresh. So one of the interventions, I think I'm jumping ahead to my next slide. Yeah, one of the interventions is really suggest that people stop masturbating to that imagery. You know, if they're doing that, there's always going to be other things that are also sexually arousing, and it's really better to focus on those things. And towards the goal, once the person sets the goal of sobriety, making sure that they're. And so the other part of that is, you know, helping the client to define what do you want your sexual life to look like? What do you think is safe and acceptable? It's not like we can hand out a ditto, you know, like that tells you. I'm a little long in the tooth, actually. We don't have a handout for like, here's what your healthy sex life should look like. Everybody should have a healthy sex life that looks exactly like this. You know, it's something that everyone has to define for themselves. So they have to define what they want their sex life to look like, with the one caveat that I've had lots of patients come in and say, you know what, I'm just quitting sex. I'm done with it. It's nothing but trouble. I'm just going to go without. And that's my plan for my sobriety. And I have to share that in my experience, that really doesn't work. You know, that we're all human beings have sexual lives, and if your goal is to never have sex again, probably not going to be able to live up to that. And it's better to plan to have sex that you feel good about, and not set yourself up for, you know, some kind of big binge type relapse where you're so frustrated with the lack of pleasure in your life that you go out and have exactly the kind of sex in dangerous places with dangerous people that you really don't. So helping people to define that for themselves, what's their goal, and also helping them explore, you know, and this is obviously a question more for therapy than for other professions, but if you ask somebody who's used crystal meth extensively, was sex better on crystal or off crystal? 100% of the time, they're going to say sex on crystal meth is so much better than sex sober. So that's a given. But what you can help them explore is, well, what made it so much better? You know, what was it that can be different for everyone? What was it like? What was that about for you? You know, was it that you felt like you're doing something that's forbidden or exploring the dark side? Was it getting rid of your anxiety about being whoever you are as a sexual person? Was it getting to act on or act out themes that you previously thought would only ever be a fantasy? It can be helpful for the person to really try and put their finger on it. And the reason it's helpful is to explore whether, you know, maybe there's a safer way you can meet that need. You know, maybe you don't have to do what you have been doing, but you can think about other ways to go after that. So talking about sexuality, very important. But everybody always wants to jump to this part is, are there any medications that help? And every year I have to break the news that there's nothing really great. There continue to be a lot of active investigations in this area looking for some kind of silver bullet, and we just don't have it yet. So while Wellbutrin seemed to be testing well for a while, seems to, you know, reduce cravings in some people, but the effect is pretty weak, and it doesn't seem to work as well in heavy users. So it's not being used as much as it was. Still under investigation, mixed results. Provigil, Risperdal. I can't really say anything definitively one way or the other. I will certainly let people know when something good comes out because it's just not there yet. Are there any medications that can hurt someone's recovery? The answer to that is yes. And I just pulled a graph from one study showing that Zoloft seemed to increase the rate of relapse compared to even placebo. I just pulled a graph from one study, but we have seen this in multiple studies. So, you know, while, you know, it's not unusual that somebody coming off of methamphetamine has depression, and an SSRI may be tried. Certainly also antipsychotics for the psychotic symptoms. All I want to say is just, you know, proceed with caution with SSRIs. You know, that we do have this data that indicates that maybe the risk of relapse could be increased for folks using SSRIs, particularly Zoloft. So it's something to just keep in your mind if you're prescribing for folks in recovery from this particular, just to worry about a little. So in this presentation, I very rarely get to talk about every single question that every single person has. So I wanted to just kind of direct you towards some resources that are out there that you can use to help continue your learning. So the best kind of general audience book, and this is a book that I've given to patients if they're well educated. You know, it's probably best for somebody with at least college education. For someone with less education, probably not as great. But in that case, frankly, I think as professionals, we can also read it and get something good out of it because it's got some really good basics. This is written by an addiction psychiatrist in New York who sees a lot of crystal meth patients. And so the book is written for patients at different stages of thinking about recovery, including those who are in the stage of thinking like, I don't really want to stop, I'm enjoying this. So he has some good suggestions for how you think about folks in that stage and how you work with them to really minimize the negative impact of the drug on their life and hopefully, you know, help preserve as much health as possible for later when they will become sober. So that's, and also it's really cheap because it's out in paperback. That's another reason I like that book. As I mentioned before, if you are working as a drug treatment professional or working in a counseling setting with folks trying to get recovery, the Matrix model is available to you free online, and it's a blessing because originally it was only available through Hazelden and it cost hundreds of dollars, and it's really lovely that you can just get the whole thing for free now. So the address on the screen there is the correct one to find many, many downloads for that. And then if you want an oldie but a goodie, the Center for Substance Abuse Treatment put out in '99 a guide to treatment for stimulant use disorders, so for both cocaine and methamphetamine. Sometimes people are skeptical that it's from '99. Why am I still recommending? I just think it's kind of a classic. You know, that they have some very basic foundational principles there that I think are still very useful, and they also have some good worksheets for distributing to patients that you can really use across a lot of different populations, really very simply and clearly written. So that's something that I recommend, and again, the price is right. You can download it for free, so that's always a plus. So those are the places I would start, and I guess I'm going to move into question time at this point. So my understanding is that, I don't know if she's still on the line, but there's a phone operator, Shonda.
If you'd like to ask a question, press star, followed by the number 1.
Great. And it looks like you can also type in comments on this little Q&A box. So if you want to type in a question there, you can do that. Some kind gentleman has just thanked me, so thank you. I appreciate that. Are there other questions or comments?
There are no questions on the phone line.
Ooh, somebody's got a question. Oh, I'm sorry. Shonda, were you saying that there is a question or there isn't on the phone line?
There are no questions on the phone line.
So somebody has asked the question, do we have any statistics on meth prevalence in other countries? Yeah, we do. What I can tell you is that the other countries where it's most prevalent, it's the worst in Asia. This drug was originally discovered in Japan, and they actually really stockpiled it during World War II. They were giving it to kamikaze pilots. And then at the end of World War II, there was, Japan was in chaos when they lost the war, and people broke into the warehouses, and like a lot of the meth got out into the general population, and so they kicked off their meth-using epidemic as early as the 40s and early 50s. And so you can really see the worst and biggest impact, and a lot of good research on meth still comes out of Asia, and it's spread from Asia across. That's why it's entered, it started on the Pacific side of the United States, and I think that's one of the reasons it's moved, from that side toward the East Coast, is it's coming out of that area. So I hope that's helpful. There's another chat question. How would you address the sex in teens? Oh my goodness. Those of you who work with teenagers, I admire and salute you. You have a very difficult job. I guess it really, well, I guess I'll start off by saying that there's no magic solution to this, that, you know, when you're working with teenagers, it's very difficult. You're constrained by you know, the fact that they're not considered full adults and that illegally, but that also they have many of the habits of adults. So I guess, how would I address it? You certainly can't go wrong with education and normalization. You want to avoid their getting sidetracked into the path of thinking that they're sick, they're wrong, they're permanently something bad about them. So that's why I would think about, you know, really normalizing these effects. As far as prescribe, you know, I talked about discussing folks' sex life, and I work with an adult population, so certainly it's easier to talk about folks designing their own sex life when they are adults. I don't know if you feel comfortable doing that with teenagers. I think that's really an individual decision and the decision of the site that you work at as to what the boundaries and parameters are. But that's a tough question. So I hope that's helpful. Feel free to comment. If there's someone in the audience who wants to say more about that, I'd be happy to hear your comment. Another question, why is the face of methamphetamine use that of Caucasian? Is there genetic propensity? Oh, question. Let me think on that for a minute. Well, no, we don't know anything about, you know, that any one particular population is more at genetic risk than another. I think it probably has more to do with social networks. Certainly on the East Coast, it's been a drug that's pretty expensive, and that, I mean, comparatively to the West Coast where it's much, 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 much more cheaper. So I'm not sure why higher risk among Caucasians. Thinking it over, I mean, in general, I think alcohol use is even higher among Caucasians as well, contrary to some stereotypes. So I guess just social norms and social networks is what I would say. I'm sorry it's not a more satisfying answer. Let's see, another question. I have a patient who used to be a heavy user who now has end-stage renal failure, and I helped him with an opioid med for severe generalized pain. What would be another non-opioid med that you can recommend for meth-related pain? I don't know that I would specifically say it's meth-related pain. And I think that you're probably doing what's appropriate, which is treating the pain. And just because somebody has an addiction risk doesn't mean that we would never prescribe an addictive drug. I have seen patients be able to be successful when, you know, you make it clear to them that you're concerned, you know, that you don't want them to fall back into another addiction, that you can move from one substance to another, that the risk of cross-addiction is really real, and that that's something they need to be very attentive and prepared for. And that if you have safeguards in place, it doesn't mean that you can't prescribe these drugs when they're appropriate. So that would be my answer to that question. Next question is, I have clients who come to the community mental health center where I work who have meth addiction. Would it be best to refer them to treatment rather than try to treat the depression, anxiety, etc.? I have tried to treat those symptoms while they're trying to get sober. Oh my gosh, great. I always think of it as a both and. You know, yes, if they're interested in stopping, a treatment center that can focus specifically on that is going to be a plus. But that doesn't mean that you need them to stop coming to therapy. They may need the additional therapy on top of whatever they're also doing. And also, frankly, I found sometimes that clients really want the security of continuing in mental health therapy at the same time as they're also doing some scary and difficult work in their substance abuse treatment program. So I don't think it's an either-or question. I think you can have both. And whatever support that we can provide, both pharmaceutically and therapeutically, in helping people struggle through the depressive and anxious symptoms of recovery, more is better. That is very clear. So an additional comment, I think of the dual diagnosis theory. Yes, that applies. This is the same person who just made the previous comment, so that's certainly comment. Are there any other questions on the phone line?
Again, that's star 1. There are no questions at this time.
Okay.
All right, Dr. Disney, we certainly like to thank you for presenting that important information, and would like to thank the NHSC webinar participants, and also be aware that you can download Dr. Disney's presentation under the presentation tab on your screen. We'd like to ask you to take a moment now to fill out the on-screen evaluation. Your opinion will help us further develop these webinars. Thanks again for attending tonight.
Thank you.